So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Carolyn Deer-Bobeck. I'm the Executive Director of the Forum on Trade, Environment and SDGs, which is located here at the Geneva Graduate Institute. So also welcome to the Graduate Institute as well. So it's really our enormous pleasure to be co-hosting this roundtable today with our colleagues from Chatham House and the Global Commission on the Economics of Water, really to try to spur a conversation in this sort of Geneva setting, in the multilateral trade setting, around the nexus or the linkages between water, trade, and sustainable development. And just by way of context, before I turn over to our co-host today, I was really inspired to organize this conversation in Geneva after going to a meeting at Chatham House where the colleagues you'll hear from today presented, I thought, just really impressive research around the water footprints of traded products. It's something I had myself had not thought a lot about, and knowing that the water is is probably the world's most valuable natural resource, vital to survival of all of us, plants, animals, flora and fauna, as you may wish, across the world. I thought it was something that just deserved a lot more attention. At that meeting, also, I had the pleasure of meeting Anna and learning more about the work of the Global Commission on the Economics of Water. As many of you may know, the Director General of the WTO was also a member of that commission and was very heavily involved in the analytical work, and I know is a great champion of the work of that commission. And we have someone from the WTO who will speak later about that. So anyway, it seemed like this was the time to try and push this issue a little bit more into the forefront of people's thinking in the trade world. I think it will take some time because it's a relatively new topic. We talk a lot about trade and sustainability. We talk a lot about natural resources like minerals and forests, and we talk a lot about impacts on pollution on the air, but we don't talk a lot about water. So I felt this was a good conversation for us to be helping to stimulate today. And with that, it's really my pleasure to turn to our co-host this morning. So firstly to Richard, who's the Senior Research Fellow in the Environment and Society Centre at Chatham House. And then I'm going to ask him to turn to Glada. Over to you, Richard, please.
Thanks very much, Caroline. And yes, we are delighted to be co-hosting this event with TESS and the Global Commission on the Economics of Water. And we do so in our capacity as one of the founding members of something called the Fair Water Footprints Partnership, which is a group of organisations that was formed at COP26 in Glasgow in 2021, which is really working with governments and private sector and civil society organisations to fundamentally transform how the global economy interacts with and values water. And it's got a particular focus on building climate resilience, supporting the needs of communities, businesses and ecosystems, and ensuring water and sanitation for all. And when it was launched at COP26, to ensure that the water footprint over which they have control and influence will be sustainable, resilient and fair by 2030. And within that mandate, there are really kind of three key focal areas. There's looking to harness the power of trade, enterprise and communities. And obviously in the context of what's going on this week, we certainly hope that we can sort of advance and have a stimulating discussion, certainly on that first trade element, and hope that today's discussion will offer some insights in that regard. So I'm going to hand over straight to Glada Lyon, who is today's chair.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Carolyn, for the lovely introduction. So good afternoon, everyone. Richard has explained a little bit about the Fair Water Footprints Partnership, which I was part of from since 2021. I'm now not with Chatham House, but I've come back especially for this because it's very dear to my heart. And what he says about the declaration, there was a story behind that, and the story was really this growing realization amongst some governments and also authorities that where trade was driving the over abstraction of water and unequal access to water globally, it was in conflict with other development and climate and security policies that those governments were trying to pursue and that they were signed up to. And the non-alignment of policies had costs. It had costs in terms of the value generated, in terms of the reputation of that government, in terms of the effectiveness of those policies, and in terms of hard risks to supplies of commodities. So if a government or company is signing up to the SDGs, if it's signing up to the Paris Agreement, to the Biodiversity Treaty, and if it's pursuing stabilization, conflict stabilization, Is it
No,
making sense?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So poor water management at the local level poses political stability risk. As we know, we've seen that from Punjab, farmers' protests, to Panama, and what happened there with the canal. We also see it in influencing politics in the UK, in the US, and the stakes are becoming more acute and faster than expected with the onset of climate change. And it's estimated that about 30% of freshwater withdrawals are used in traded commodities. And that's not even to mention green water transfers that Anna Dupont will touch on, or pollutive waste. And as I think Anna will touch on, we can't think about managing water only at the basin level anymore, given the way that production of goods use it, and the way that they're exported elsewhere to meet demand. So the actors involved and the responsibilities are multiple, and nor can it be reduced to putting in a few ground pumps or providing some toilets or drip irrigation, which has tended to be the focus of development work. It's a much, much bigger challenge. And also, as I think the WTO would agree, water also needs trade to work on a multilateral basis, because there are water scarce and water plentiful regions. There needs to be international trade, and there needs to be cooperation on the standards for that. So on the other hand, when you're looking at the buyers, and as Richard mentioned, companies were involved in the declaration, the retailers, the buyers of products from other parts of the world where there's water scarce or climate challenged conditions, they face potential consequences for their reputation. There's new reporting requirements, there's potential legal liabilities, but admittedly these have been fairly weak. We produced this report tackling trade-related water risks in 2024, and found this huge gap really in terms of legislation and incentives for the importing side to really care about what was happening to water in the production side. But there is a severe concern about the security of the supply chains themselves and the price of goods as well. And we've seen how drought followed by export bans has led to food price rises, for example, and there's often local and even regional conflict that can erupt over poor water management, and that can play into other grievances about inequality. So what are the incentives to get this right? As I mentioned, there's a really big gap there. There's virtually no consumer labeling, perhaps no consumer labeling that can tell you what effect a product has had on water in the area of production. As was mentioned in the last session, the parts of that product may come from many different areas and companies and countries, so retailers find it hard to trace their consumption. And I thought this report was brilliant, the Reviving Multilateralism that TESS produced last year, and in it Marian Jansen from the OECD talks about non-product related processes and production methods, which I'd never heard of, PPM, but that's the WTO language apparently for those issues such as water use that the WTO has found difficult to deal with. So right now, as we know, the global trading system is in flux. We heard in the first meeting on this morning about it being messy, but there's also this chance to reform and remake institutions to better fit the world that we're moving into. And the world we're moving into is very environmentally challenged, and the hydrological cycle is one part of it. So there's a chance to get the system to work in harmony with fairer development and with nature. It's a chance to center fairness, including, we hope, fair water footprints, and to make use of science as a barometer of decision making. But where do we begin? The first part, I think, is to grasp how production of goods affects water and where they are being produced and sent, where those products are being produced and sent. And so who bears responsibility for that and who should be engaged? And then to explore how trade might play a role in creating a fairer and more nature positive system. So to kickstart this, we're bringing together some critical parts of the picture. Anna DuPont, research and policy consultant for the Global Commission on the Economics of Water, which has done some amazing work. She will say a few words to open up a new way that we might look at trade. We have Sajal Mathur with us, who is counsellor in the Trade and Environment Division of the WTO, but has a long career. He was telling me since 1998 with the WTO, who will give us a perspective from there. And we have my former colleagues, Richard Peshaya and Bargaby from Chatham House, who will give insights into the research that they've been conducting in the three areas: food and agriculture, minerals for technology, and textiles. So I hope there'll be then a chance to discuss how this interacts with your work. And the idea will be to come up with some ways forward, some practical ways forward, which will hopefully find the way into a bigger report, which Chatham House is publishing as part of the Fair Water Footprints partnership next year. So with that, I'll hand over to you, Anna.
Hello, everyone. My name is Anna Dupont. I am honored to be here with you to discuss about water, which is quite rare, as it is often overlooked in global trade conversations. But as most of you may well be aware, trade moves water rather invisibly. In fact, each year, over 1.8 trillion cubic meters of water are traded in the form of crops alone. That is the water needed to grow these crops, which are then traded. And today, recent satellite data are showing that nearly a quarter of the world's cereals crop are located in regions that are identified as future drought vulnerability hotspots. That's threatening supply stability and price volatility. Now, this exposure is intensified by policies, including subsidies, that keep irrigation water artificially cheap or free, which encourages excessive extraction and masks the true amount of water that can be consumed safely and sustainably locally. In fact, 23% of these could be lost if irrigation becomes unfeasible because groundwater cannot keep up or rainfall grows more unreliable. And I will come back to that in a minute. The situation is even more alarming given that 35% of the world's poor are located within these water scarcity hotspots, often with little adaptive capacity and fiscal space to buffer these shocks. Responding with emergency finance or disruptive trade restrictions will prove far costlier than investing now in resilience, robust water governance, and using trade as a stabilizing force. And this is good news. When trade reflects the true opportunity cost of water, aligns with sustainability standards, and is paired with transparent data and science-driven hydrological and ecological context-specific threshold, then it becomes a global stabilizer. Subsidy reforms offer a unique chance to shift away from production water distorting incentives towards policy that reward efficient water use and adoption of sustainable practices by both farmers and corporations. International corporations, as seen in recent studies on the Brazilian soy sector, for example, handle more agricultural water than most individual countries. A handful of traders control the majority of water redistributed between continents via virtual water. This underscores the tremendous potential for rapid progress through corporate water partnerships, supply chain standards, and data transparency. So now the evidence is clear. Water and trade can no longer be separated. And I am most grateful for Caroline and glad I have put this opportunity to speak about this. Today, we'd like you to reconsider the foundational role of water in shaping food and commodity markets and in underpinning the resilience of the multilateral trading system itself, as the Global Commission has highlighted in its report. Now let's look at this for a moment. The water cycle. I'll dive into this for a few minutes. The water cycle is a continuum of blue water, surface and groundwater, and green water, the soil moisture and red-fed flows. Green water in particular has long been overlooked by policy and economics, is the source of nearly half of the rain falling on land. This rain is recycled moisture that evaporated from forests and wetlands, which we know are Earth-critical hotspots, but which are now recognized as also water sources. This is how upwind forests are decisive in mitigating drought severity in far distance locations. Protecting these hotspots helps stabilize rainfall patterns and agricultural productivity downwind. This is a connection that is now backed by mounting scientific evidence. Conversely, increasing agricultural degradation and deforestation is now directly linked to suppressed rainfall and worsening droughts in region downwind. This is changing the way water has cycled for the past 12,000 years. For the first time, humans and their activities are changing the source of precipitation. The consequences of this are more frequent and extreme droughts and heavy rains, which are poised to disrupt global trade. Export commodities such as cocoa, coffee, and palm oil, for example, are almost entirely reliant on rainfed green water systems, making their production and trade highly sensitive to shifts in rainfall. Water storage is disrupted, and some regions are losing water very rapidly. The number of droughts in developing countries has increased by 233% since the 1960s. 3 billion people and more than half of the world's food production are concentrated in regions facing projected declines in water storage. This is the scale of the challenge and the class of cascading problems which lie ahead of us. Strengthening the ecological natural infrastructure, including the moisture flows that I just described, is not just an environmental imperative. It's essential for a healthy and stable global production and trading system. When trade is used as a lever to foster local to regional to global water security, shocks and disruptions can be actively managed for the benefits of all. Looking ahead, the trade policy community can act as conveners, standard setters, and catalysts for integrating hydrology into global trade disciplines, informing the direction of change with equity, economic efficiency, and environmental sustainability at the core. The Global Commission last year issued its report and attempted to sketch out policy pathways to move things forward. Amongst the concrete opportunities for collaboration, we may include embedding water variables into policy frameworks based on the true carrying capacity of the biosphere, establishing global minimum criteria for sustainability, including green and blue water footprints, threshold and standards, identifying priority regions that sustain atmospheric moisture flow, Congo, Amazon, South Asia, and targeting investments, supporting the shift towards high-resolution supply chain mapping, and designing collective action schemes across sectors and scale to anchor needle-moving innovations. Global water risk has consistently ranked among the top threats to economic stability for over a decade now, says the World Economic Forum. Yet financial systems, corporate actors, and trade rule books have been slow to fully integrate water into core decision makings. With water-scarce regions tending to import water-intensive goods, connecting trade flows to water security policy highlights critical yet hidden systemic vulnerability patterns. The recognition of water as the invisible currency of our global economy, along with an improved understanding of the scale of today's hydrological challenges, are pivotal to evolving how trade is governed, incentivized, and financed. I wish us all a fruitful discussion, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. Sajal, over to you.
Thank you to the organizers, TESS, Caroline, Chatham House, and of course, um, the Global Economic Commission on the Economics of Water as well, because the DG, as Anna just mentioned, was the co-chair of this Global Commission, and I'm glad I'm speaking after Anna. She has at least covered the ground. One of those slides actually had a global moisture map. If you had a title, I mean, international trade flows or something, it would look perhaps something like this as well, where you see these lines and dots connecting the dots as well. But what actually is true, at least when I looked at the topic, and Caroline is right to say that, trade and the world of water haven't really been discussed too much together, at least not recently, or at least only recently, I would say. Before that, not so much. Because how does trade fit into the picture? And the topic of today's session, water, trade, and sustainable development. I can speak a lot about trade. I can speak a little bit less on water, and of course I can say a bit on sustainable development. But I want to just set the scene by saying that when I was looking at this topic initially, and I looked at it only a couple of years ago, I have been in WTO a while, as you said, but it only with the Global Commission, actually, to start off with the DG being a co-chair of that. And of course, there was also a UN Water Conference in 2023. So it was around 2022 and 2023 that I started looking at this file, just to see where are the interlinkages. Where does international trade and trade rules, where does international trade per se deal with water? For example, in trade in goods, if you look at the whole HS classification, there's only one item, 2201, which is about bottled water. Okay, and trade in that is not too much. It's in a couple of $1 billion. Trade in services, a bit more, one can say. There are trade in services, both as far as drinking water is concerned, or with sanitation or environmental services with regard to cleaning up discharge, etc., which are, of course, in the context of the WTO rule book and GATS, etc., covered. Agriculture, we have subsidies, including for irrigation, for example. So there are these points of inflection, but perhaps the bigger issue is that there is actually a lot of trade in what you could call virtual water trade. Virtual, not real, but virtual. Because traded goods, we're talking about some sectors after this, textiles, minerals, and food and agriculture, actually do contain a lot of water. And there is, of course, a lot of potential of improving these flows in a way that where water scarce regions or countries or members don't focus on water intensive products. They focus on less water intense products, where you can actually have certain synergies between water and trade in a win-win sort of way as well. So that is one interesting angle. But I'm digressing a bit, but maybe I'll just ask you a question. I mean, yesterday was a special session of the General Council where the agreement on fisheries subsidies entered into force. Okay, everyone has heard of SDG 14, life underwater. Okay, underwater. But may I ask anyone? I mean, who all know which is the SDG with regard to water per se? I'm sure some of you who are experts and working on this field would know it, but many people may not know that it's SDG 6, which is the SDG which is about availability of clean drinking water and sanitation for all. Okay, it is a topic a bit like SDG 14. Because I've worked a bit on SDG 14 and fish subsidies in a former role. It's a bit like SDG 14, SDG 6 is a bit like that for me, because it is a very, very cross-cutting subject. It's a subject which actually has 8 targets, okay? But perhaps the prime driver, the catalyst for this has still to be found, because we're talking about accelerating it still. I mean, next year we have another UN Water Conference coming up in UAE. So this is a very timely conference, Caroline, because preparations are starting for that. And I guess inputs can obviously be fed in, including the trade, water, sustainable development angles at this point of time. But when I was looking at SDG 6 on the UN TESS website, to see the targets, to see the progress made. It didn't make for very pretty reading, let me put it that way, okay? And I should also put a caveat here. I'm speaking, of course, as WTO Secretariat. I'm not pointing fingers at any member or anyone. I'm just speaking as a Secretariat staff member without prejudice to my membership. But if you look at water and SDG 6 and its 8 targets, and the very essence of it, clean drinking water, in 2015, 68% of the world had access to, so the quality and the quantity, 68% had access to clean drinking water. Today, it's 74%, so a change of about 6%, okay? But that means still 1/4 of the world does not have access to clean drinking water. And that translates into not millions, but billions of people. 2.1 billion people do not have access to clean and safe drinking water. When it comes to sanitation, the figure is not, I mean, at least the advance is a bit better, but we're certainly not near the all part, okay? So sanitation in 2015, 48%, so less than half the world had access to sanitation services, sanitation basically. Today it's 58%, so a 10% jump there, but that still leaves about 3.5 billion people without access to sanitation. Hygiene, COVID, for whatever you might say, at least it taught us about washing our hands regularly. But out here also, if you don't have, say, wash basins or access to running water, maybe it's not such a practical idea after all. Today, 80%, in 2024, 80% of the world had access to safe hygiene. So that's again, 1.7 billion people out without hygiene services. So the idea was not to put a doom and gloom kind of picture out here, not to paint that. It was not the intention, because I think I want to just say that this actually requires a whole of society kind of movement, whole of government, all the stakeholders, all the think tanks, all the NGOs, all the international organizations. Caroline, you'll be also happy to hear that UN Water, which is a UN coordinating body which deals with water, actually has an office in WMO. And I didn't know this either till 2023. So it's not just you, it was also me. And that's just opposite our building. So what I'm trying to say is that there are many actors involved, but there's perhaps been a lack of leadership or driving force behind this SDG itself, this SDG target itself. And that in fact has changed a bit. I should not always have said, I want to paint only a doom and gloom sort of situation out here. Actually, with the UN Water Conference in 2024, that was the first UN Water Conference after a gap of almost 50 years. Because that was not the first UN Water Conference, that was the second UN Water Conference, the first being in 1977. So after 1977, the second UN Water Conference was held in New York under the co-chairmanship of Netherlands and Tajikistan in 2023. There has been a lot of momentum generated through this and the work of the Global Commission on the Economics of Water, for example. I asked Anna just before this session, what has been the changing point, the tipping point to bring water more as a topic, a more central topic in our discourse today? Because to be honest, I am hearing a lot more about water and trade, etc., in the last 3 years than I had in the previous 25. And there is a change. I mean, I would definitely say there is a change in the discourse. There's also a new special UN Secretary General Special Envoy on Water, Ms. Marsudi from Indonesia, the former foreign minister. And I'm bringing these parallels because I see parallels between this and SDG 14, because you also have a special envoy, Peter Thompson, for SDG 14. And a lot of the SDG 14 was actually front-loaded. A lot of the deadlines of SDG 14 were actually 2025 or before. Unfortunately for water, that champion was missing till very recently, but now it's there. There is a lot more interest, a lot more data, as Anna was saying, a lot more data, a lot more body of research on this topic, and a lot more, I think, interest in doing something about it, because we are talking about really critical, what you can say are critical, what you take for granted, basically. Issues like sanitation and drinking water are issues that you take for granted almost in most of the world, but it is not a reality for most of the world. So that is the context of what I wanted to say in terms of scene setting with SDGs and water. Now, maybe a little bit to say on yeah, maybe before I go into trade, maybe I should say something about trade right now. Just to say that, yeah, trade also is not the panacea to everything, okay, but it can be a part of the solution. How, for example, already we from 2023 onwards, I've been doing a bit of research on this topic, and I find that a lot of members are taking measures, whether they're regulatory, whether they're support measures, with water conservation and management in mind. Okay, so for example, a technical regulation, like you have energy efficiency, you may also have water efficiency. Okay, water footprint, of course, fits in there as well. You may have support measures. Okay, a country like Australia, for example, I think Caroline's from there, so I'm taking Australia as an example. Australia has, in its agreement on agriculture, domestic support subsidies and agriculture subsidies, a large proportion of its notified measures, especially for irrigation in the Murray-Darling Basin, I think it is. Yeah, it's about water conservation. It's about better use, better preparation for droughts. Okay, but you also may have floods in other parts of the world. Water is either, sometimes there's too much of it, sometimes there's too little of it, right? So trade can play a role. There is, of course, potential of, like you have for energy, when you talk about renewable energy, there has been, certainly in the last decade or two, a pivotal moment with energy with regard to, say, solar, wind, and so on and so forth. I think there's an earthshot moment for water too, potentially. And if there is one in terms of technology, that technology, for its dissemination, for its application in a broader sense, it requires trade. So trade is part of that solution. Maybe I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. That was a really good place to stop with the earthshot moment, because we hope so too. And I think a lot of what you talked about in terms of the SDGs not making the progress that we expected is because they're against systemic incentives that are pushing in the other direction in many cases, and that's what we're going to talk about now. So I'm going to hand over to my colleagues, Richard Pasher and Bhargavi. They're going to do a bit of a deep dive into these three sectors, food, minerals, and textiles, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So,
thank you, Gleda. Yeah, before we dive into the sectors, just making sure we're all having the same conversation. So I don't need to dwell on the blue-green water definition. Anna's done a great job of that. I'd just like to introduce one more colour into the palette, which is grey water, which is used to kind of dilute pollutants, and that can create issues around water quality and heat stress within the water cycle. We're going to talk a lot about water footprint. So what do we mean by water footprint? It's essentially the amount of water used to produce each of the goods and services that we used. So we can measure this for a single process, for a product, for a company, for a country. So, it's measuring the embodied water in whatever our unit of measurement is. And we can think about it not just in terms of the sort of the product or the entity that's producing it, but in terms of where the water comes from. We can be thinking about a specific river basin or an aquifer or a country, or we can be thinking about water footprints globally. I've told you a bit about what the Fair Water Footprint Initiative is, but when we introduce that word fair into water footprints, what we're essentially talking about is these 5 elements around this circle. So we're talking about zero water pollution, we're talking about sustainable, equitable withdrawal and water use, access to safe water and hygiene and sanitation for workers, working with and protecting nature, and planning for droughts and floods. So just kind of thinking a bit more holistically about what using water well means, and using water fairly means, beyond just the sort of quantitative measurements of water embodied in a product. So yes, we're going to dive into some specific sectors, starting with food and agriculture. You have your watercolours on the inner ring there and your sectors around the outside, and agriculture is purple. So you can see that in terms of sectoral water use, agriculture is by far the dominant water sector across all. It's virtually the only sort of sector using green water in a very significant global way. It's using 92% of all blue water that's consumed, 53% of all grey water from all sectoral uses comes from agriculture. So agriculture, you can't really talk about water without talking about agriculture. I mean, Peshere and Barghabi will, but you know, agriculture is a key part of the picture. And to Anna's point that the green water is often overlooked, that's true in terms of where the data is, and this is why that's a problem, because over 80% of global cropland is green water fed. 60% of global food production is green water fed. So, you know, absolutely critical for global water cycle. In terms of the trade element, obviously, as was mentioned, trade can be a very significant enabler both for more efficient water use, but also obviously in terms of foreign investment, in terms of jobs. It can lead to greater water efficiencies, but it can also be unsustainable. And so around 20% of all green and blue water combined that is used in agriculture is traded, but about that accounts within the blue water sector, about 15% of unsustainable irrigation is this embodied virtual water. So hugely significant in terms of the efficiencies and sort of fairness that we can find within the trade system in terms of how we think about using water within agriculture. This slide, I don't expect you to be able to read all the details down the side, but we essentially have a product list down the side and the water footprint volumetrically represented by the dots going across the top. And there are huge variations here, both in terms of products, between products, and through space. So sort of going down the list, we see very sort of heavy animal products at the top, very water intensive agricultural products. But the different colours of the dots represent the mean water use embodied within each product and the median. So some of these have massive skews in some very water intensive production areas. And so what this is really saying is that there is huge potential to make improvements to water efficiency on the demand side by switching out products, and on the supply side by thinking more carefully about how we produce food using much more regenerative agricultural practices and where that production takes place. And the Global Commission had a mission, one of their 5 missions, particularly around this area in terms of the water saving potential. On the demand side, obviously, as I said, that's dietary change. The supply side, this is not purely a volumetric question. Yes, we can kind of move those dots further towards the left, but if we do so by moving production to more water stressed areas, we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot. So I want to emphasize it's not a purely volumetric question. This really requires robust water governance to think about how that water is used within different geographies, how it's traded across geographies. And so moving to trade specifically, this is agricultural's virtual water trade over the past 30 years or so, increased nearly 2.5 times. And on the left-hand side, you can see the absolute volumes of water that's embodied in traded goods. On the left-hand side, that's the unit footprint per ton of produced product. So as the absolute volume has gone up, so the water efficiencies in each product have increased as well. So what this is really showing is that the volumes of goods that have been moving around the global system have increased even more than that diagram on the left shows. In terms of the sort of product breakdown, you can see that is everything sort of improving in terms of some of those efficiencies as they sort of come down from left to right. But the luxury foods is exhibiting a bit of an uptick. So we're seeing sort of more water intensive use recently in some of these. So this is things like stimulants, coffee, cocoa, teas, spices. So yeah. Wine. Wine. Potentially. I couldn't honestly answer how that's categorized in there, but yeah. So there are definitely comparative advantages to be had from global trade, but as I mentioned, there are sort of local scarcity issues. There are fairness issues that we need to be thinking about as we think about virtual water trade. In terms of, so now this is just looking at unsustainable blue water use. So there is still a paucity of data on the green water side, so I don't want to kind of malign that, but just looking at the blue water side and moving into the kind of more looking just at the unsustainable patterns. So this is where abstraction is greater than replenishment. And 15 countries essentially account for 90% of global exports of unsustainable water. This, I should say, this is food products. So this is agriculture excluding cotton. Around a third of unsustainable water use is from cotton, but Bhargavi is going to talk about textiles later. In terms of the product mix here, we're thinking about rice, citrus, wheat, maize, sugar, accounting for about 90% of these volumes. On the import side, it's slightly more diffuse, with 20 countries accounting for about 2/3 of global water, unsustainable global water inputs, but still, relatively concentrated. I think the point to take away from these two graphs is we are seeing a wide spectrum of economic development involved in these trades. This is not just a south-north flow. This is kind of a north-north flow, or this is a south-south flow as well. So in terms of the actors that involved, this is, very much needs to be a global conversation. Still very much a north-south conversation, but it's wider than that. I just wanted to come back to one of Anna's graphs. This is green water. As I said, we don't have such good data on green water, but if you look at the trade flows here and the water scarcity represented by the greens underneath, you can see, for instance, that China, which is a very water-stressed, water-scarce environment, is, this is a trade is a means of reducing some of those stresses by importing from less water-stressed areas. But of course, to Anna's point about disruptions of the water cycle, if you start abstracting too much from Brazil in terms of Chinese imports, then what does that do to your rainfall over the Amazon? What does that do to global climate patterns? So this is not just a question of moving things from light green to dark green. That's part of it, but we kind of need to be thinking about green water's role in the hydrological cycle writ large. I'm going to skip over this other than to say that we're expecting to see irrigated areas more than double in sub-Saharan Africa by 2050. So in terms of sort of some of the geographies as stress points and some of the geographies of the solutions, this is a rapidly evolving dynamic. So as we think about the current environment that we're in, as we think about the role of trade and water, we are obviously in kind of a febrile environment at the moment. We're seeing a lot of geopolitical disruption to trade. We're seeing the imposition of tariffs, export restrictions, increasing protectionism. We're seeing a supply chain fragmentation. We're seeing lots of new challenges and opportunities from within the trade system, and increasingly we're sort of seeing supply chain resilience as a broader security concern. So that's the context in which some of these water trade conversations are happening. In terms of the physical environment, we're seeing, lots of changing climate impacts. There's question marks over that, how exactly that's going to shake out. Some people think that there's going to be a decline in global trade due to the increasing cost of water-intensive goods. Others say that the water savings possible from trade means that some sort of water-intensive trade volumes might increase. And I think lots have thought that wheat trade in particular may be very significantly reconfigured as climate impacts bite. In terms of where the demand is coming from, that's increasingly going to be a low and middle income country conversation. The role of China in terms of driving the changes there is probably going to decline in relative terms. We're going to see more import demand from India and Southeast Asia. We're going to see, as I mentioned, irrigation expansion in sub-Saharan Africa. So there's lots of kind of moving pieces here, and quite how that sort of dietary pattern picture and the trade picture and the environmental picture all come together, I think it would take a kind of brave person to put a fine needle on that. But I think in terms of messages to take away, virtual water trade is going to become ever more important, but contested mechanism for conserving water and redistributing food production around the world. And so what that means is supply chain approaches to fair water footprints are increasingly urgent, but this can't be a purely kind of supply chain conversation. It needs also greater geopolitical attention on addressing some of these larger structural factors which are going to shape global trade as well. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much, Richard. So much to think about there, Bashir. And bear in mind, we want to leave time for discussion, so we have about 12 minutes, I guess, between you two.
No worries. Thank you, Gleda. See if this starts.
And also, while you're just preparing, if you'd like to come and sit around the table, we've got some space, please do.
Thanks, Gleda. So my name is Peshea. I'm a research associate at Chatham House's Environment and Society Center, and I've been preparing the research on the metals and mining sector. So I'll just start by talking about the ways in which a mine interacts with water. This is a very generic diagram because I'm sure you know that mining looks very different in different geographies and for different commodities. But what this shows is the sources of water for a mine and the types of sources, and then how water, again, at a very general level, will flow through. So mining is probably one of the more diverse industries in the way that it interacts with water resources. And local climate and hydrology are going to dictate a lot of the infrastructure requirements at a mining operation and also influence the nature of the water-related risks. There's a lot of uncertainty in mining, including around the stability of water supplies, the potential for flooding of open pits, uncontrolled discharge, as well as extreme and unpredictable weather patterns that are increasing because of climate change as well. At the global level, mining is a relatively small consumer of water, especially when you compare it to something like agriculture, but in regions where mining is occurring, it's a major consumer. And so operations are going to source water from groundwater, streams, rivers, lakes, and commercial water service providers for various operational activities. But this all comes with risks. There are water balance and hydrological risks, where a change in local hydrology can determine if a mine site is water negative or positive, and if poorly managed, can result in either too much or insufficient water flowing through. There are also water quality risks, where exposed mine materials to oxidation and weathering processes can cause water pollution. Then, of course, we have tailings dam failures and worst-case scenarios. Rehabilitation and post-closure risks are also a threat to water resources because water impacts can also occur after a mine has either been abandoned or rehabilitated. South Africa is an interesting case of this because there's been a lot of issues of acid mine draining because of abandoned mines. So the combination of the direct and indirect use of water, as well as the pollution of fresh water, can be understood as a mine's water footprint. And mining operations can often have very significant water footprints because of the large volumes of water that they consume, as well as their high potential for pollution and competition with other sectors. This is a map depicting baseline water stress in 2050 under a business as usual scenario. And you'll notice that many of the places where there are significant reserves of minerals are also areas facing significant water stress. At the moment, Chile, responsible for 80% of copper production, in Chile, 80% of copper production is concentrated in extremely water scarce areas. And by 2040, that's expected to increase to 100%. 2/5 of Russia's iron ore production is expected to shift from a high water stress context to an extreme water stress context by 2040. So in many of these regions, mining is a well-established industry, and that's expected to grow, not just because of increasing demand, which I'll get to shortly, but because resource-rich countries also want to capture more value downstream for both local and national economic development. But these activities like refining, manufacturing, and processing consume a degree of water as well. So I mentioned before, we're seeing increased demand, and this is going to continue to rise. Demand is being driven by both the clean and non-clean tech sectors for products like wind turbines, electric vehicles, digital technologies, AI and data centers, as well as military technologies. And in the IEA's 2025 Critical Minerals Outlook report, China is cited as being the largest source of demand, but Europe, the United States, and Japan are also recognized as major consumers of a lot of these key minerals. The impact of the demand that these places create is not neutral because supply is being met by countries and regions that are experiencing higher levels of water stress and climate vulnerability. Established producers like Australia, producers in Asia and African countries, and other producers in Latin America are supplying minerals under conditions of often medium to higher levels of water stress. There are also emerging producers that are making sizable contributions to supply, but experience climate vulnerability. And circularity and recycling will play a role in meeting demand in some cases, but we're going to continue to need primary production, at least in the short term. And this is going to come under a context of a changing climate and water stress. So I think I've established that critical minerals production is often concentrated in these very climate vulnerable and developing economies. And this has been highlighted as a geopolitical and supply chain security risk. And so we're observing trends like tariffs that are reshaping how minerals are sourced, export controls, longer lead times for mines, as well as degrading ore qualities, as well. And then lastly, resource nationalism is affecting the trade landscape. So these trends are definitely going to complicate sourcing strategies, but the mining industry and actors along the supply chain also need to seriously consider the impacts of mining to water resources, as well as the consequence of water scarcity to their operations. Here we have just a little breakdown of some of the water-related risks. But I want to just start by highlighting that this scramble to secure critical minerals is propelling a lot of global north countries to forge deals with their mineral producing counterparts in the global south. And these deals, which we've seen in the last few years take the shape of MOUs, come alongside a very fragmented trade and security environment. And this is all part of efforts for places like the US, Europe, and other Western countries to diversify away from China. And this trend is going to continue, where we have advanced economies depending on imports from developing and emerging economies for years going forward. And there's water embedded in these mineral commodities as well as their end-use products. And where they're imported and exported, we can understand this as virtual water trade. As more countries are securing access to minerals and climate impacts worsen, these trade relationships can be passive contributors to local impacts through their production processes and pollution, like I established earlier, or they can be a more active partner in driving sustainable change and improvements. To do that, we have to consider the risks. Environmental risks like extreme weather events, drought, flooding, and water scarcity can interrupt a mine's productivity. A global study of 1,400 mines found that approximately 1/5 of those sites were located in areas already where water consumption was exceeding 80% of total water available. There are also trade risks where interruptions to mining operations and production can compromise supply chain resilience and the ability to meet rising demand. For example, a drought in early 2022 in Chile caused the Antofagasta Minerals to drop production by 24% in its Los Pelambres mine. And this all culminates into various degrees of financial risk that affects investors, mining companies, retailers, importing and exporting governments, but also local communities. There's also reputational risk. Unsustainable water abstraction in mining, particularly in those regions facing water scarcity coupled with poor governance, can negatively impact local communities and their access to water and their livelihoods. So where we fail to manage water use and quality, this creates social, economic, environmental, political, and economic risks and jeopardizes a company's license to operate. So responsibility also sits then with governments who create the kind of policy and regulatory environment that needs to be enforced for companies to invest in and operate. This slide here, again, is a very generic one showing electric vehicle batteries as a share of global lithium and nickel demand. But for the sake of time, I'll just focus on the portion showing lithium. Unfortunately, the full complexity of the actual supply chain for electric vehicles can't necessarily be captured here, but I'm hoping to highlight a few things. The first is that at the extraction stage, you'll notice that Australia and Chile account for just over 50% of lithium mining. And in Chile's Atacama region, indigenous groups have expressed concern that mining is depleting their water supplies that are already under pressure from issues with rainfall. China then dominates lithium refining and manufacturing, as it does with a variety of other critical minerals. But mineral refining in China also severely impacts water resources, releasing a lot of toxic waste into the Yellow River and surrounding areas that's affecting ecosystems and human health. And then lastly, we have electric vehicle battery demand coming from China, but then also places like the United States and Europe. So these water-related risks don't just start and end at the site of production. They can extend along the entire value chain, especially where additional water, is consumed downstream. And the financial implications can be quite large. Globalized supply chains mean that the location of mining and processing of ores, manufacturing of intermediary and end products is going to happen across several different countries, and a number of companies are going to be involved and have a role to play. I'll quickly just conclude by talking about some of the opportunities for fair water footprints in the mining sector. I think I've established, and many of you probably also know, that the mining supply chain for their products is extremely complicated and can vary across geographies and for different commodities. So this presents one challenge. Additionally, the final product of a mineral, or minerals, I should say, looks entirely different than what's extracted at the primary stage, which is a bit different than I think the other two sectors. But fair water footprints can support understanding the direct and indirect water consumed and polluted in production, as well as that local impact to communities where minerals are sourced. They can help us understand the interdependencies between countries. And so this is why a supply chain approach for mining is incredibly important, because you can tell a really interesting story about a product's life cycle. I'll just wrap up by saying we can also allow fair water footprints can also allow for production that's more responsive and supportive of the needs of local communities. We just have to understand the caveat that mining is really complicated, and it's not going to necessarily look uniform from mine site to mine site or from commodity to commodity. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Pashaya. And having worked on this report with Pashaya, I know you didn't get to talk about Indonesia and nickel, but I do recommend that you have a look into that, or look at it when the report comes out, because it's a very interesting story on so many of those fronts you talked about. Bhargavi.
Hi, everyone. My name is Bhargavi Bharadwaj, and I've been working on the textiles paper. So just to quickly take you through the water footprints in the textiles industry, we already understood how this applies to the agriculture and food and the mining sector. But the textile sector, we really need to think from pre-production to the end-of-life component. So, we need to map out where the specific areas of most water-intensive processes are. Firstly, upstream fiber production. We know, for example, that one of the most water-intensive natural fibers is cotton. So there's a lot of stats that are usually discussed on the water intensity in producing a cotton t-shirt, which requires around 2,700 liters of water to make, mostly for the production of cotton. However, what's less discussed is the man-made fiber production, and also the production of synthetics, which often in the pre-production stage requires water and cooling and other mechanical processes as well. Therefore, there's a lot of data scarcity even from the onset when we're talking about pre-production of textiles. Next, when we go to the core manufacturing stage, particularly the wet processing, dyeing alone uses around 80 to 150 liters per kilogram of fabric. But it's not just the volume. As you can see in the diagram, there's a generation of wastewater that's loaded with dyes and chemicals and elevated pH levels that also directly threaten local communities who live downstream from these facilities. Now, if you come back to one of the discussion areas for fair water footprints, it's zero pollution and access to wash for workers. And these are usually the communities that are living downstream. And finally, once the product is created, there's also the wastewater component, which, it's the quantity of water that you then need to bring the wastewater into an optimal level again. And also, when we look at end of life, chemical recycling is actually one of the most water intensive processes. And the outcome of this is then essentially only 1% of textiles, used textiles, are then recycled back into new textiles. The rest becomes a waste management problem for developing countries that import our discarded clothing. So in this diagram on the right, we wanted to demonstrate the business as usual scenario for water stress in 2050, drawn from WRI Aqueduct. And when we're looking at the hotspots of where water is most stressed, we kind of need to understand the existing global value chain for textiles. And what I've done in order to demonstrate that is take top exporting regions currently and who the top importers are in order to demonstrate that story. So of how water travels through trade. On the left, if we follow the flow, Brazil is the largest cotton exporter and it ships primarily to China and Bangladesh. But notice India here because they face severe water stress, yet they are the world's second largest cotton exporter. These countries are essentially exporting their water, but we also need to remember that the textiles industry has been a real source of development in these countries. So the issue isn't as simple as this region is water stressed and we need to relocate, manufacturing. We need to consider the just transition and sustainable development component when we're thinking about this topic. Finally, for finished textile exports, China dominates this market with major flows going to US and EU, Japan and Canada. Bangladesh follows, mainly with their trade going to Europe and America. And then if we look at what happens to our finished textile exports, used textiles, they flow right back to Pakistan, UAE, Kenya, and Ghana. If we're reading between the lines as well on the trade classifications that are included within that table, these trade classifications can't distinguish between a water efficiently produced t-shirt versus one that is not produced water intensively. They have the same HS codes, but vastly different water footprints. And we have a linear pattern here where water-stressed regions export raw materials and absorb our waste, and then the wealthier consuming economies remain insulated from its true environmental and social costs. So now that we are speaking about the water impact of these growing demand in textiles, textiles uses around 93 billion cubic meters of water annually. And just to put that into perspective, a 2019 UNCTAD study said that that's enough to meet the drinking water needs of 5 billion people. We're looking at a growth from 124 million tons of production in 2023 to 160 million tons by 2030. This industry is responsible for around 20% of global clean water pollution and 4% of freshwater withdrawal globally, which is what was spoken about shortly before. What's the hidden complexity in this landscape, though? And this is essentially that 80% of a product's design are pre-planned in the design stages. So it's essentially something that we can control. We often measure water efficiency, but that's not the same as we've understood as a fair water footprint. And especially when factories are not able to manage their wastewater properly, then they also disrupt safe water access for entire neighboring communities, and that has real social implications as well. Beyond that, there's also the geopolitical realignment. One of the conversations you might have come across in recent weeks or months is about nearshoring. So this concept of nearshoring, if we take the example of Mexico, for example, it's emerging as a nearshoring hub for US textile production. However, it also faces serious water stress, with northern states projected to see escalating water scarcity by 2050. We may simply be shifting our water problems to new geographies rather than solving them by way of that. Now, coming to this slide, speaking a little bit to what Richard had flagged in his presentation on the unsustainable blue water footprint of cotton. So the diagram on the left shows the export of cotton, unsustainable blue water footprint of exporting cotton, where China is not only the largest producer of cotton, it's also the largest exporter of finished textiles, and it has the highest volume of unsustainable blue water exports. India is the second largest producer of cotton. However, it has the largest portion of unsustainable blue water imports globally. That's the diagram on the right. The question isn't so much whether we'll face imports for India, exports for China. Yeah. The question isn't whether we'll face water constraints in textiles. It's whether, oh, yeah, I think I didn't notice that. The question isn't whether we'll face water constraints in textiles. It's whether we'll be able to proactively manage them or be able to react to the really complex value chain where some parts of the value chain are facing higher water stress and higher risks and respond to them proactively. These uncertainties make planning very difficult. For climate impacts, we know, for example, that South and Southeast Asia face a greater risk for droughts, floods, and heat. However, we can't predict exactly when these will happen. This creates massive supply chain vulnerabilities and local changes like groundwater depletion, which we know is a challenge in South Asia, and shifting monsoon patterns could accelerate these risks faster than decision makers, both for businesses and governments alike, can adapt. This again brings about that conversation on just transition and sustainable development and how the textiles industry can really foster these conversations, because we know this impact is happening and businesses are already talking about their supply chain vulnerabilities. Finally, to come to the end of life impact for the textiles industry, this impact is stark. Responsibilities often fall disproportionately on countries that bear responsibility for importing used and secondhand materials, because only 1% of used clothes are recycled into new clothes. And this is an example of Ghana and the countries that are exporting their used textiles into Ghana. I wanted to end by flagging some opportunities from this research that have really come to light on what the textiles industry themselves are talking about, businesses are speaking about, and so are governments. So to begin, supply chain risk planning. This is, a conversation that comes up where you essentially map virtual water dependencies and assess your water risks for emerging production hubs before the next crisis hits. Preparedness is better than cure. Secondly, the production transition. Emerging, themes like investing in scaling the circular economy, as well as regenerative agriculture has proven, especially in the regen agriculture space, in pilot projects, they've been successful. This is being used a lot in countries like India. So, we need that sort of backing of like working with smallholder farmers to see if these can be deployed at scale as a solution. Secondly, investments, or thirdly, investments at the factory level are extremely crucial, because even if we're making the changes at that, international or national policy level, how does this, create implications for factories and tier 2 suppliers, for example? We need to improve sort of the water reuse technologies from flagship facilities to their entire manufacturing base and address the capital costs that they need as well to strengthen enforcement. And fourthly, I keep losing track of my numbers, but differentiated standards. So creating water-specific metrics that distinguish between water scarce and water abundant regions like we do for carbon. And one of the things that came up in the discussion was on regulatory measures and the regulatory divergence that we see when we're speaking about water and trade as well. But I think it's also at that subnational capacity to build really the capacity at that subnational level to monitor and enforce waterway protection where production actually happens, because often that there's a lot of burden on them to respond, but not quite the strength and the impetus to be able to execute that. So to sum it up, the textile industry stands at a crossroads. We can keep externalizing our water costs to vulnerable communities or build systems in place that account for water's true value. The technical solutions do exist, but we do need a collective will to implement them at scale. And as we flagged, there's already some solutions that are the tech sector is leading on as well.
Thank you so much, Bhargavi, for Richard. That was incredibly rich and fascinating and somewhat disturbing. I hadn't seen all those graphics to date, and some of them are very stark, as you pointed out. We're ending with some potential ideas for discussion topics, but I really welcome you to come in, ask our panelists any questions or just come up with your own perspective. Please say your name and where you're from when you make your intervention. Have you got your hand up, Ron? I feel like you have. Come on, Ron, please.
Okay, thank you. Ronald Steenblick from the Quaker United Nations office. Very interesting, and it's actually one of my favorite topics. When I was Director of Research at the Global Subsidies Initiative 20 years ago, one of the topics that we really wanted to put stress on was subsidies to agriculture. So I was glad that came up in the initial discussion. So I have two questions. One was to any of the panelists, particularly Anna, if she can recommend what she considers to be the best source of a global estimate of subsidies to water, because I worked for a while in the agricultural directorate of the OECD, and let's say we were a bit constrained on the extent to which we could look into irrigation subsidies. And so what we actually captured, and I think what's still being captured in the producer subsidy equivalent numbers is only a fraction of the actual subsidies to irrigation. So that's one question. The other is that I think that there's really a lot of potential for work on the degree to which alternative sources to bottled water could be more developed, and that ties into, to me anyway, the whole issue of services related to potable water in the discussions on trade and environment, reducing barriers to trade and environmental services. I worked on that 25 years ago. And definitely get the impression that there was a lot of sensitivity around trade related to potable water, and I think it's really a real pity, because everybody thinks in terms of large municipal water supplies and Western levels of treatment, so that all the water that's going down to flush our toilets is drinkable, whereas that there are so many other alternatives that don't necessarily mean selling water in plastic bottles, but could be intermediate stages and so forth. So there's so much that could be looked at, and that's fascinating, I think, in this whole area. But I thank you for organizing something on this important topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. I wanted to Anna to answer that. But
can I just ask a question too?
Please, yes.
Or are we waiting for it?
No. I can. Let's go to those questions, because I know also, Dr. Ngozi is really passionate about the agricultural subsidies issue and water subsidies. Are you going to pick up on that?
No, just that there was one question online.
Fantastic.
From
microphone.
Sorry, there's one question online from Alan Nicol from the International Water Management Institute, and I think that Richard is going to be able to tackle it. But it says it's important when talking. He says, great discussion. It's important when talking about these large numbers and issues of fairness and unsustainable use, that we distinguish water use in large-scale industrialized farming versus smallholder usage. He says irrigation subsidies, for example, have very different net effects according to the part of the agricultural economy one is referring to in any specific country context. He talks about the need to break he says great points, but there's a lot more to unpack. So I'll let the speakers respond to that. But I did just want to note that when I was hearing a lot of the discussion today, one of the challenges, at least for us in TESS, is that we can go, say we're talking about trade and sustainable development or trade and sustainability, we can take a sector by sector by sector approach. We can take a policy tool approach, kind of around standards or regulations or subsidies. You can take a kind of fora approach, like these supply chain initiatives among governments. We're looking at trade arrangements or agreements or voluntary things. And then we can also look at particular resources. So, water, mining, so on. Then we have lenses like nature positive, around the Kunming, Montreal, the global biodiversity framework. We can look at it through the lens of climate resilience. I was thinking around the SDGs, there's also just SDG 12. I think a lot of these presentations today have been about if it's about the embedded sort of water footprint, it's really about products in general. It's not so much around clean water and sanitation. Obviously, it's linked, but it can also be around just production. So basically, my head was exploding thinking, what is the best way to approach this and bring this really critical issue to the trade cooperation arena? Of course, it belongs in many different arenas. I'm inspired to think through how one could bring some of this to the UN water conferences. Those of you working on water no doubt have this on your list anyway. But I'm just trying to think, if I were sitting in a trade ministry, for example, is this just another issue that they're going to think, oh my God, another issue? Or do we bring it to them through a nature lens, through a resilience lens, through an agriculture lens? There's a circular economy, sort of bioeconomy sort of lens. So that's what I'm just grappling with a bit. I mean, it obviously deserves a lot more attention and understanding that this is sort of a core issue. We've got that on other core sort of environmental issues, and especially because it's so linked to economic risk. Anyway, I'm not sure if I'm being super coherent around that, but I do think it's sort of a dilemma as how best to get attention to this, or what are the multiple frames that one could use to make it have some traction, because it's so linked to many other issues. I'll stop.
Definitely. What is the right framing? Was it critical levers, and maybe that issue of interoperability of standards that was raised this morning is useful here. Anna, water subsidies, do we have any idea of a number?
I don't know about the number because you'd have to have a granular approach, I suspect, to this and questions, but I recommend to a report that was issued by Richard Lamania from the World Bank. It's called Detox Development. I don't know if you've heard of it. It came up in 23 and 24.
It's one of these that embrace the idea that externalities for subsidy. So it's a very confused discussion because of that.
Yeah, but I still think that in terms of the information you want, it's the best we have, because within the OECD, unfortunately, I don't have anything.
And Richard, Alan's question, and hello, Alan, thank you for the question on large agribusiness versus small farmers when we talk about water. This came up a lot when we were looking at the trade-related risks.
Yeah, and I think one of the broader points in the question was sort of, this is so contextually specific, I think was kind of an underlying point, and I fully agree. I mean, I think you have to think about the scale, you have to think about the particular aquifer, and I mean, even in large-scale agriculture, you will often have lots of landless workers working on the farm, so their water and sanitation and their access to clean water is just as much an issue on those large-scale farms as it is for small-scale workers. So I think I fully agree with the point that Alan's making. I think that's what is so difficult about this topic. It varies so much from geography to geography, from river basin from river basin. But at some level, we can't just be managing the issues on a basin, on an aquifer basis. We need to be thinking about sort of the responsibilities of the consuming country as much as the producing country, the producing geography. So I think you've identified a real challenge, but I totally agree with the point. And just in terms of how we frame the issue, I mean, I think, I don't have a good answer. I think it is a bit context by context, but I think there is a danger here of having a very insular water conversation that kind of stops at the water issue. And like, is that really the end goal, or are we thinking about broader supply chain nature resilience? And I think the context into which you are speaking, I think that probably depends how you frame that conversation. But there are certainly places where water issues are very much at the kind of forefront of how climate impacts are affecting people, and there are certain places where you can't have a climate conversation for political reasons, but you may be able to have a water conversation. So again, it's probably horses for courses.
Yeah. And I'd love other people's thoughts about framings and, and I'm going to come back to you, Sajal, because I'll get some other ideas and then I'll come back to you. And just very quickly on bottled water, I'm glad you raised that because I was having a conversation with a friend in New Zealand and she was saying how angry people were that a foreign company had come and bought land in New Zealand and then extracted the groundwater and then were exporting it as bottled water. And that really aroused sort of local anger. And you think, well, if that happens in New Zealand, please introduce yourself.
And your comment preempted very much so what I wanted to add to the discussion. But my name is Laura Turley. I work with the Geneva Water Hub. So thrilled to be a part of, crossing this bridge to the trade community here in Geneva. We are located between the University of Geneva and the WMO here, so just your neighbors. And we're a center of competence on water for peace. So our work is all about sharing water resources and sparing them, so protecting them from degradation, whatnot, to promote social cohesion. And so one very clear link to this discussion is about anticipating and avoiding conflict around water resources. So I think this is a really, really important discussion. I'm really delighted that the trade community is having it. And I was actually just going to mention what you just brought up, Gleda, about large-scale land acquisition is a clear way in which we see, there is research that shows that large-scale land acquisition tends to be for land with good water access. So land where the water table is relatively shallow. There's some quite interesting research that showed that a few years back, and I'm happy to share that. So I just wanted to add that point to the discussion and then make two short questions. I'm not as familiar as I should be, being Geneva-based, about that WTO and its inner workings, but Mr. Matsur, I'd be really curious to know what you think the WTO could do in this space as far as, providing guidance on water footprints or, sometimes this kind of clustering countries around, are they kind of water scarce and importing? Are they water scarce and exporting? Sometimes this sort of typology of countries can be an interesting way as well to bring attention to the issue. So just any thoughts you have on what the new WTO could do. And then for Richard, I also took a short question about the crop production. Did you divide in your analysis, or you've probably done several on the topic, but looking at food crops versus non-food crops? Because obviously you can kind of, in some ways, even if you have water-intensive food crops, sort of think, okay, well, some sort of justification nutritionally or otherwise, but when you think about non-food, that sort of feels more wrong or something. So any thoughts on that would be appreciated. Thank you again.
Great points. Thank you. And by the way, I know the Global Commission did emphasize land ownership in the report as being an extremely important issue. And Richard's also written about land extensively, and he will be happy to share that report with you. But it is linked because we are now seeing these water grabs, you could call them. Is there any, before I turn to Sajal, any other points on the kind of practical, pragmatic areas to progress the water agenda multilaterally? No thoughts yet? Okay, Sajal.
Thanks, Clara, and thanks for the question as well. I also want to just maybe say a word about the framing question that Caroline had asked as well. And she was asking, should it be through the nature lens, climate lens, SDG 12, SDG 6, SDG XYZ? And I think what my take on this is perhaps the framing of water should be through the water lens. Because there is this topic, and I'm sure Anna would agree with me there, because this topic is actually big enough, important enough to be framed in itself as a topic, because that has been part of the challenge, because it has been subsumed in other topics. And there hasn't been a champion of this so far, which is what gap which the Global Commission was trying to fill with regard to, like you have the Das Gupta report for biodiversity, you have Stern report for climate change, and this was what this was trying to do. So that could be a framing, but I'm not saying that trade is the answer to everything in that framing. And here I would probably point to this next UN Water Conference, which is coming up next year, which has already identified 6 thematics for which they are developing concept notes and papers, for which inputs are also sought from all stakeholders. The deadline, if I'm not mistaken, is middle of next month, 17th of October, for stakeholders to provide comments. And just to read out the list of what is the thematics: water for people, water for prosperity, for example, which includes valuing water, water, energy, food nexus, sustainable water management, etc., wastewater, water for planet, water for cooperation, water in multilateral processes, and investments for water. So these are the 6 themes for which they are seeking inputs. So I'm sure that this is, of course, an opportunity to also shape those discussions at UAE next year. To answer your question, thank you for that as well. Geneva Water Hub. Again, I must say I keep learning more about the world of water in fora like this. As you said, the world of trade is unknown to you. Sometimes the world of water is unknown to us in the trade domain, but we are getting to talk more often, which is great. What can the WTO do, and what does it do already? I might add as well. I mean, of course, it's trade. So we've talked about how virtual water is an important element, because actually direct trade in water is not such a big amount. I mean, with due regard to what Ron just said, bottled water is not a big item, not big ticket trading item. Okay. And in trade and services also, there have been historical and other reasons for there being limited trade. Bulk water trade does not exist really because of a lot of variety of reasons as well. But having said that, what can be done in terms of this topic as a whole? I think there are a mix of measures. You know, people talked about regulatory and standards and regulations. Okay? That is one space where things are being done by members in their trade policies, in the trade policy toolkit. People are doing stuff for water, better water management, better water conservation, better water efficiency, better water dissemination. Support measures. So just as you have regulation, you also have support measures in this area. We've talked a bit about subsidies. I know Ron is he holds it very dearly to his heart, and he knows a lot about the topic, but we are seeing some measures also being taken for water in mind, not just climate, not just biodiversity, but also water. Price and market measures. And finally, research. I mean, there was the flagship research output of our colleagues in economic research is something called the World Trade Report. And a couple of years ago, just I think 2022 or 23, it was on trade and climate change. But even the water dimension did get discussed a bit in that report as well. So of course, more can be done, but this is perhaps where I'll stop. And of course, there are other things as well.
That's extremely useful, not least for you guys, I think, in putting together the report. We've only got at max 7 minutes left, so let's get maximum extraction out of that. Anna.
No, I just wanted to quickly add to Sajal's point. I think I just wanted to share with you the fact that when we set up the Global Commission on the Economics of Water, obviously it was on water, but there was close to 0 water experts on the commission. So it's sort of built on the observation that all the things that are happening to water are taking place outside of the water sector. So yes, to taking a water as a framing, but framing it as a systemic issue, encompassing equity, encompassing economics, encompassing trade, and all the functions for what we call a livable planet. So institutions have to onboard the expertise. They cannot just wait. And I want to just insist on the urgency of the challenges that we're facing. Really, institutions have to evolve. They have to be able to manipulate the data that are becoming more and more strong and robust. They have to give it meaning, and they have to shape the directions they want to contribute to building.
Thanks, Anna. And I should say, I mean, we didn't mention it at the beginning because I take it everybody understands that, but there is this context, isn't there, of the watering down of corporate accountability legislation at the EU, at the US level, and also this drift away from emphasis on ESG. Not to say that the good things are not, happening, they are happening, but you're also fighting a battle of narratives, right? And wording and how you frame the topics. Okay.
Just ask about,
please, Richard.
Sorry, so just on the food versus non-food disaggregation, I mean, to some extent, so we can obviously take out cotton and other sort of textile crops, but when it comes to cereals, which could be used as either animal feedstocks or food, or even bioenergy feedstocks, it's so much more complicated because they are essentially a fungible commodity, and I think that's where it becomes back to a data and a traceability problem. And that's very hard. And I think Stockholm Environment Institute, their trace model is doing a bit more of that kind of granular supply chain mapping, but that kind of knowledge of exactly where it's going is not really widespread at the moment.
Do we have anything else from online?
Oh, I'm just continuing to be inspired about how we can take this conversation forward. So for me, at least, this has been a great, and it's great to meet you also from the Water Hub here in Geneva. That's great. Part of the process of these kinds of conversations is connecting the right people together and thinking through what do we need to do to move this issue forward. Obviously, we have an extraordinary champion at the WTO and Dr. Ngozi, who's been involved in this work. The question is, how do we, and I know this is not only a trade issue, but as we have a trade discussion today, just trying to think how could one help build a trade cooperation discussion around this? So I think our first task is to find a way to have this discussed 300 meters away over at the WTO in a way that resonates with some of the members there who may then be champions for talking more about this topic. And there, in the context of the structured discussions on trade and environmental sustainability, there are governments who have put forward certain themes. So I could imagine this could be something where one looks at it, understanding the footprint side, understanding, I think we've never seen, I don't think the World Commission's report has been presented in the WTO context, has it?
Not by us, but Ngozi might have.
No, I don't think it has. So anyway, just to say there's a simple thing that we could get done. And as you say, that's even when we framed the event, we talked about it. It's, if it's the world's most valuable resource, it deserves to be spoken about in its own right, but it may then need to be taken forward in different conversations as well, right? So just to say, I'm all for supporting that if it will be useful. I think the research that we heard about today is really brilliant. Your work in the Commission is obviously just excellent. And so we need to give it a bit more visibility, I think, as you say, the challenge is urgent. And it's going to manifest itself in all kinds of different ways, ranging from conflict, economic risk to food security challenges. We can just list them on and on, right? But yeah, so sorry, that was just my closing thought. I always like to think, so what are we getting out of this conversation by way of a next step? So I think there's a follow-up conversation to be had on ways in which one could build some further energy around this. I mean, you guys have created the basis for that in your work. And if we can do anything in the trade sphere to help drive some of that forward, we'd be delighted to do so. You have a great ally also in Sajal, I think, over there as well.
So, and thank you, Carolyn, for, you've been this amazing point of connection between the trade and sustainability world. So we're really happy to have done this collaboration with you. I think I can say that on behalf of my colleagues at Chatham House, former colleagues at Chatham House. Oh, sorry, Ruth, you have your hand up, quick.
Yeah, I just thought it might be a good opportunity to let people know that Chatham House will be having a conference in October to have this conversation about water and trade. And so that is a very particular next step that we could all participate in. And I will let someone from Chatham House give more details if you're interested. Thank you.
Thank you so much for raising that, Ruth. Though I'm no longer involved in it, it looks to be a really brilliant agenda and very forward-looking, very much focused on best practice, what's really happening on the ground, what can drive better outcomes for producers and exporters to also benefit the development aspect too. So please keep in touch with us all on LinkedIn, follow our work. We'd love to have the conversations after the meeting as well, depending on what you're interested in. I just want to say a huge thank you to our panelists. Thank you. Thank you to you all for coming, and thank you to those online for joining us. We look forward to the next steps. Thank you.